So, indirect realism, that's what we're going to be talking about today in your epistemology section. So the way the specification describes it is that what the mind directly perceives, what we have direct access to, are mind-dependent objects that are caused by and represent mind-independent objects. So the idea that actually what we directly perceive are sense data that represent a material external world, which is the cause of that sense data. So why did indirect realism arise in the first place? Well, the thing it has in common with direct realism is the idea that there is that mind-independent material world. But with direct realism, when you have the problems of illusion, hallucination, perceptual variation and time lag, what all of these are suggesting is that what we actually directly perceive, it's not the world as it is. It's not a mind-independent world of objects. And that actually the world of perception and the world of reality are two separate things. So what we are perceiving is this mind-dependent sense data, which may vary when the object doesn't, which may even exist when there is no material object to correspond to it, which may be a delay from the initial object. It's a little confusing because we tend to use the word object to mean matter and material, but the way that the specification describes it quite accurately is that sense data are mind-dependent objects. So that can be a little confusing, but it is the terminology that you have to use. So what we end up with then is the world of matter, which exists mind-independently, and this sense data being the plural. So sense data are our private perceptions of objects. They exist only when perceived, so they're temporary. They exist in the mind of the perceiver and therefore are perceiver dependent and perceiver variable. So if you take this object here, the mind independent book will have one shape, and it will be the same for everybody, and it exists whether it's being perceived or not. The sense data of this book, the way it smells, the way it feels, the way it looks, the way if I was being a bit weird if I licked it, the way it tastes, that's only going to exist as long as I'm perceiving it in some way. So if I'm not smelling it, tasting it, touching it or perceiving it, or seeing it through my vision, there is no sense data of that book. Now, what we're saying is that what I have direct access to is the sense data of the book. Now that includes the way it feels, but feel is part of that sense data. So, that solves your problem of illusion, hallucination, time lag, perceptual variation. So in the case of illusion, for example, it's the sense data that has the property of being bent when you see a stick in water looking bent. The object itself doesn't change, the object doesn't have that property, but the sense data does. So what problems actually arise from that? Well, the main one is the idea of skepticism. So once you've divorced the world of perception, the world of reality, if you like, the world of mind-independent objects, how can you actually be sure that the sense data that you experience are actually caused by and represent this mind-independent world? Now, there's two stages to this. You could ask whether the sense data actually resemble the mind-independent world. So is my sense data like the mind-independent external world? But also, how do you know that it's actually caused by a mind-independent external world at all? So, for example, if you go back to Descartes and his evil demon, you were having the sensations, but without there being the corresponding mind-independent object to go with it. So the whole world could be an illusion, the whole world could be a dream. So if you think about the example of the film The Matrix, when people were plugged into the Matrix, they were still having the sensations, they were still tasting, but the taste, that sense data, was not caused by a mind-independent material world at all. It was just a brain simulation. And the Matrix is actually inspired by Descartes' skepticism. So common words to describe this would be like the private cinema. So imagine you're sat in a cinema and you're looking at the screen and you're being shown images. Now, what you can't do is go outside and check if what you're perceiving is actually a genuine representation of what exists in that external world. So if I'm watching a film and I'm watching Tom Hardy and I'm thinking, okay, well that is a representation of a real person who exists in the external world. I've never met him. So how do I know that actually that is genuinely what he's like? He could have been doctored, he could have been enhanced with CGI. Maybe that doesn't exist. Maybe I'm just being fooled into thinking that's caused by a real Tom Hardy who was filmed for that. Maybe it's not, maybe the whole thing is an illusion. And we've all been fooled into thinking that there's a real Tom Hardy out there. I mean, I've never met him, you've never met him, I assume, so how do we know? So we're really not at the mercy of our sense data if that's true, and that's a sceptical worry for a lot of people. I mean, you often hear it described as the veil of perception, not the veil of deception. You'd think it would be deception, but it's not, so be careful with that. A lot of students call it the veil of deception. So this veil of perception is literally like having a veil over your senses. Well, they are yours, the veil is your senses, and you can't lift it to kind of get this direct access to what we are perceiving in the mind-independent world. Everything is filtered through this veil, and that puts us in a very vulnerable position. Now, if you are going to accept indirect realism, you cannot get over that problem of proof of the external world. You are not going to prove it in the Cartesian, I can't possibly doubt it sense. So what can you do to suggest that, well, we really don't need to be sceptical about this mind-independent world? Well, Russell, he agrees that you cannot prove it, but obviously we have sensations. So what he talks about is the external world as the best hypothesis. So, you know, there's many things that we can't prove in law, in science, but we go with the best hypothesis we've got. Now, I'm having these sensations. You know, I'm having a sensation of a book. Either that is caused by a mind-independent external world, which causes my perceptions, or it's not. And my sense data are not caused by a mind-independent external world. Well, the mind-independent external world is a better hypothesis than there not being one. So despite proof, it is perfectly reasonable, logical and sensible to believe that there is a mind-independent world out there. Now, the reason he says that the mind-independent external world is the best hypothesis is because how would it compare to anything else? So imagine that I perceive a cat, and the cat's sat over there, and then I close my eyes, or I take a nap, or I walk out the room and I come back in, and the cat's over there. There's two explanations for that. Either there was a mind-independent cat, an object existing in the external world, and it moved. Or what? Maybe it disappeared when I wasn't perceiving it because objects only exist in my sensations, and it reappeared over there. That is no explanation at all. No, that's not even a bad explanation, that's no explanation. So really the best hypothesis we've got is that mind-independent external world. Now Locke says the same thing. You can't kind of prove the external world, but you really can argue for it. Firstly, if my sensations, if this book, this is Bertrand Russell's Problems of Philosophy, by the way, it's a really old copy and it smells nice, it's really cool. So if this book was a figment of my imagination and not an object in the external world, I ought to be able to control my sense data of it, but you know, if I open my eyes, the perception of that book is involuntary, I can't help it, which suggests that there's an external world out there causing my perceptions rather than it being something I'm just making up. You've also got the coherence of the senses. The different sensations we have fit, they cohere, they work together. So for example, if I'm looking at this book, well that book ends where I expect it to end when I'm looking at it. So my touch and my sight are corresponding. It's not like there's a mismatch where I'm thinking the book's ending there. That's not what's happening. Which again suggests one object giving us the various sensations of it. And Catherine Trotter-Cockburn uses the example of a train going into the distance. So we tend to associate like vision and sound in a very coherent way. So as that train goes away, it gets smaller and it gets quieter. That coheres, again suggesting the same external object. So again, no proof of the mind-independent external world, but certainly arguments for it. But do we have any right to say that our sense data resemble or represent a mind-independent world? So Berkeley points this out. He would say, well, what have we said about sense data then? So let's say my sense data of this book is temporary. We've already said if I'm not perceiving it in any way, the sense data doesn't exist. It's also variable. So if you look at it from different angles, you've got variable sense data, perceiver dependent. And yet the object itself, the mind-independent object, is permanent and it doesn't change. So how can this sense data, which is temporary in loads of different shapes and loads of different sizes, actually have anything to do with this object, this mind-independent object? So what Berkeley is saying is that sense data cannot represent mind-independent objects because they're too different. And it's really weird for me to make claims about two things being similar when I only have access to one of them. So I'm saying all my sense data are like the mind-independent external world. Well, that's like me saying to somebody, oh, you really resemble your sister, but I've never met their sister. That'd be a really weird thing to say. They might not even have a sister. So that, again, would be a really strange thing to say. So why am I saying that the sense data are anything like the mind-independent external world, when the very foundation of indirect realism is you cannot access that mind-independent external world? So that's Berkeley's criticism there. I mean, there are ways to kind of salvage indirect realism, because what you could say is that this is what something Descartes said, because Descartes was an indirect realist. It's not that the sense data resemble the external world, the mind-independent external world, but they do represent it. So if you take, for example, a map, an ordnance survey map, and you take the contour lines, etc. on that map, then those contour lines don't resemble hills and mountains. They don't look like hills and mountains. Neither does a symbol for a church look like a church. But it does represent, and represent means it gives me the essential information, it's giving me what I need. So, you could say, somebody could represent a company by giving the essential information. The sense data could be representing rather than resembling. So I don't really need to know the genuine colours and smells of this room. I need to not walk into the table and fall out the window. So it would be potentially an opportunity to kind of bring in Locke's primary and secondary quality distinction, that what we actually get accurate information about are the primary qualities, the motion, quantity, extension, size, rather than the secondary qualities, which aren't actually essential to our survival. But I mean, that's something separate. And Locke's primary secondary quality distinction is something you need to know, but you wouldn't have to necessarily include in an indirect realism essay, because it is specific to Locke's indirect realism. But it is a way to suggest that there's some kind of balance to what we are getting from our sense data. So I always think with this, you've got to also question where the next theory arises from in relation to this one. So I briefly mentioned Locke's primary secondary quality distinction. Now, what he suggests is that the primary qualities, the sense data, give us accurate information about their primary qualities, and they are not perceiver dependent, whereas secondary qualities are. Now, Berkeley picks up on this, and Berkeley, with his idealism, suggests that even the primary, so-called primary qualities are perceiver dependent. So, for example, motion. So if you were a housefly, then, and say you were trying to swat that housefly, then it would seem very, very slow to housefly, but very, very quick to us, which is why we always try to swat a fly and you can't actually catch it, because motion is actually different. So for Berkeley, there is nothing that is actually mind independent at all, no quality at all. Hence, the whole object is mind dependent. So that would move away from there being any mind independent qualities or objects or anything at all, mind independent objects. Another problem for Berkeley is that skepticism. So I've got these perceptions, and these are supposedly representing, caused by a mind independent external world. But we don't know that, and we will never know it. And for Berkeley, why is Locke, as an empiricist, talking about matter that you never actually experience? So actually, to be a better empiricist, you define objects as collections of ideas, and you close that gap between perception and reality. So there's nothing to be sceptical about, because just like direct realism, you are in direct contact with the world as it is. So what you need to think about when you're talking about indirect realism is you cannot get over the fact that you will never be able to prove the mind-independent external world. Do you think that Locke and Russell and Catherine Trotter-Cockburn give you sufficient reason to discard that scepticism? Or do you think that the introduction of sense data have actually caused more problems than they've solved? In which case you need to revisit direct realism perhaps and solve the problems of time lag, illusion, hallucination, perceptual variation without sense data. And you do need to be able to respond to all of those issues. Alternatively, although not particularly common, you could move to idealism and suggest that actually we're going back to direct access, but direct access to objects that are collections of ideas and are completely mind dependent. So you've got a number of options there. Don't just plonk another theory on the end of an essay when you're doing perception, but if you've highlighted problems that another theory can solve, then that's absolutely fine. Okay, I've tried to keep this quite brief because I know we're 2 days away from the exam at time of recording, but hopefully that was of some use to you. And like I say, good luck with everything.